Greetings, everyone. Welcome to a very special hour of Poetry Spotlight, readings and discussions with Biblioasis authors and McMaster alumni. My name's Jeffery Donaldson from the English department here at McMaster, and we're very pleased to invite and be listening to this evening the poets Michael Fraser, Alexandra Oliver, and Luke Hathaway. While we're taking in this event from different parts of the country and perhaps the globe, McMaster University recognizes and acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Wampum belts are beads bound onto strings. This particular one, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, narrates Haudenosaunee history, tradition, and laws. Just finished myself actually doing some work on the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, and there is a kind of poetic and metaphoric brilliance at work in the relationship between the images on the Dish with One Spoon collar and with the dish doing its own kind of having its own kind of conversation with the notion of shared land, and then the one spoon working in this kind of brilliant metaphoric way to invoke notions of sharing itself. So we are guests on the territory where we currently have the privilege to study, live, and work. It is important to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land and the history they share with it as a step towards reconciliation. This event itself is made possible through the English and Cultural Studies Department at McMaster and the Faculty of Humanities, McMaster Alumni, and Biblioasis, our publisher this evening. Biblioasis is a literary press based in Windsor, Ontario, committed to publishing the best poetry, fiction, and nonfiction in beautifully crafted editions. They also operate a bookstore in the great city of Windsor, and during their 24-year history have become known as one of Canada's most prestigious small press publishing houses. Thanks to everyone who has made this evening possible, to our organizers and poets. A few housekeeping details to begin with. All participants are muted and the videos are turned off. If you have a question, we ask that you type it into the chat box. We have time allocated towards the end of this set of readings to gather questions together and pitch them at our poets. Each poet will be doing a reading, and then after each reading, we'll have with me and the poet a brief conversation, a little back and forth, and at the end, we'll bring everyone back together, all the poets back together at once to respond to any questions that you might have. Everyone registered for this event has been entered into our giveaway, which is a book bundle featuring all the newest collections from our poets at Biblioasis. We have 3 book bundles to give away, and we'll announce the winners at the end of this event. Every reason to stay tuned if you didn't have one already. I'm going to just read quickly the 3 biographies of the poets to get started, and then we'll move to our first poet, Michael Fraser. And starting with his bio, he is published in various national and international journals and anthologies. Michael Fraser is published in Best Canadian Poetry, not just in 1, but 2 different editions, the 2013 and 2018 Best Canadian poetry collections. He's won numerous awards, including Free Fall Magazine's 2014 and 2015 poetry contests, the 2016 CBC Poetry Prize, and the 2018 Gwendolyn McEwen Poetry Competition. Luke Hathaway will be our second reader. He did doctoral work at McMaster University under Jeffery Donaldson's feckless and incoherent supervision between 2009 and 2017, and now teaches at St. Mary's University in Kipuktuk, otherwise known as Halifax. He is the author of 4 books of poems, most recently The Affirmations, and many works for music and the theater. He is joined by his friend and co-conspirator, Daniel Cabena, a singer who works increasingly in the realm of musical and textual curation, bringing new words and old tunes together in provocative and delightful ways. Dan and Luke remade The Affirmations together as a work for the ear in the winter of 2022. It will shortly be released as an audiobook by Biblioasis. And our third reader then will be Alexandra Oliver. Alexandra was born in Vancouver, British Columbia. She is author of Meeting the Tormentors in Safeway, Let the Empire Down, and the chapbook On the Oven Sits a Maiden, Frog Hollow Press in 2018. She is co-editor of Measure for Measure, an anthology of poetic meters, a PhD candidate in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster. She lives in Burlington, Ontario, with her husband and son. Welcome to all three of you. It was Alex actually who got the ball rolling to make this event happen. She was in touch with Susie O'Brien, the chair of our Department of English here at McMaster. Let her know about all of these collections being published at once, and that two of them are current and former PhD students in the English department. So that gave us every reason to concentrate this celebration around Biblioasis and the Alumni Association. So welcome to all three of you. Michael, let's get started with your reading. Well, I'd like to show each of the books on the screen. This is Michael Fraser's new book with Biblioasis called The Daybreakers, an extraordinary, verbally ecstatic, intense and colorful history. We want to put that in quotation marks.
Yes.
For all kinds of reasons that he and I might talk about, but a beautiful montage of recountings of the participation of African-American Canadians in the American Civil War. Michael, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me. I will read two short poems. We are on tight time limits. The first poem is Frances Jane Scroggins Brown. I card raw wool and think I see him abeam through the window. He walks the path upholding a black bumbershoot in this gully washer rain. I look again and only see the sky's draggy waterfall cutting the tag alders and stump fence from sight. My mind's at the end of its row. The mooing swoo lean one way against the freestall. I ribble off our Savior's words. I know he'll provide larder to fill the root house. I told my oldest he must deacon skills his father knows. The glim brightens this room, lets the daylight down, and furnishes these brush arbor walls. I need to turn the bats into rovings and ready them for spinning. I know one day he'll leave the coop. I know he'll be delivered. And those last two lines are for her husband, Thomas Arthur Brown, who at the time is imprisoned in the States. But I will move on to the next poem, Fort Wagner. They crawled across sun-scorched beach sand, clambering beneath cannonball, bombardment blazing from the fort's stone brow. The burnt sour egg, sulfur reek flowed into their rooters as the shoreline convulsed with each smoothbore cannon blast. Men spilled into eternity's tide hole in the sloped, quivering ground hauled around them. Bullets chunked up idea pots like a dull grubbing hoe. Every air blast boomer wail presented cut glass sharp. Heated metal shrapnel tickets to the breath's sapped tag end. The eagle's clear pith repaired to that sky home from where we all come.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Michael. beautifully done. I feel like we just need to have a conversation now about the poetics involved that lie behind your particular your way of reading these poems. I just beautifully aligned something that the poems are already telling us about how they need to be heard, and then your own particular way of hearing it, just the intense verbal color and invention that you're working with. But let's go back to that word I used in the introduction, this notion of the book of poems as a kind of history, and maybe, I guess the word montage came out of my mouth too, somewhat randomly, but that's rather appropriate, isn't it? How do you conceive of that relationship between the historical dimension of the work, the homage spirit that you write it in, and the intense lyricism at the same time? You're obviously imagining that those two complement one another.
It's a very good question. The way I view it, I can only write as myself in terms of, if something is historical, I have to let the historical aspect of it fall to the wayside and essentially create my own world. Because one of the issues that I had when I was researching this was even the historical records themselves are multifaceted. There are, one example I could use, there was the 14-year-old in St. Catherine's who in one version was tricked into joining the Union Army, and another version, he enlisted, right? So even the historical record isn't necessarily 100% accurate, and which historian's perspective does one follow? So early on, I realized that it's not a work of history, which was very freeing, because I realized it's poetry and I have poetic license on some level within reason to pursue it the way I wanted to pursue it. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so basically, yeah, because there's no one definitive historical account. I think that allowed me to play around and definitely to insert my imagination heavily into it.
You know what aligns with that, I think, very beautifully in the book as a whole. Your poems are like a masterclass in neologisms, right? Reinventions of verbs and nouns, hyphenated adjectival relationships, and so on. And it's that spirit of pushing the language to the limit, so that the reader really is forced to hear every line in a unique way that that is itself a kind of unique perspective on history.
Yeah, and more important, I'd just like to point out, when I had finished the first draft, the neologisms, which really words, American regionalisms taken from that time, there were probably 3 times as many. And it was actually, I was very self-indulgent in retrospect. And thank goodness Luke had a nice cutting, and through cutting away the ominous, and just, there was a mass of all these terms that I think I could not part with. But thankfully, by severing, a good third of them, it actually freed the poems and freed the language. Each neologism that's left is actually more potent, and it tends to come to the fore more. It sings in the air more. I fell in love. Bumbershoot was the first word I came across, and that was read. When I remember I was waylaid. I literally fell out of my chair. Bumbershoot, what a perfect word for umbrella. And then I came across other words like play pretty for toys, and just.
One I liked was deacon. You have to deacon this as a form of knowing. I thought that's such a brilliant turn.
Yeah, and what I found most fascinating, a lot of these words are still in use. throughout the South, but more particularly in the Middle Atlantic states and into Appalachia.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are people, gully washers apparently quite popular in various
Yes.
parts of the South. So yeah, so at some point, my sister, I see my sister in quotes, but she lives in Massachusetts, so I'm about to send her the book. And I know she has friends from the South, so I'd be interested to hear if they're used to a lot of the terminology that's in here, if they're familiar with it.
Wonderful. I'd love to keep talking for an hour about these elements. They really just kind of speak to my own sense of the best of what a poem can be. I want to say I don't even have a question to pitch in this way, but I have this sense in the poem that you read, people have heard now. You've got this marvelous, rather quiet line, but beautifully evocative. My mind's at the end of its row, and I can't help but feel that's you talking about yourself as a poet as well, with all the different senses of what row can mean. Do you want to try and pretend that was a question and start speaking?
It's funny because the second poem I read was for Wagner, and I wanted to initially I wanted to emphasize the importance of the outsized impact that the Black Canadians had. These volunteers, literally there were 2,000 of them, and they were at Fort Wagner, which was fought by the very first Black regiment in the Union, in the American colored troops.
Yeah.
And the story of how that the 54th was formed is just fascinating. I know we're running out of time. But more importantly, what they accomplished at Fort Wagner was like, it was groundbreaking because that attack, it was the first time that the Black troops were actually in battle, and they gained the respect of the entire Union, because obviously there was tremendous racism. A lot of people didn't think Black troops would fight, and just the entire story behind that regiment. I mean, and it was turned into a movie. It was turned into the movie Glory. So the 54th was actually filled with a lot of Black Canadians. And there's an interesting story behind that, which probably take an hour. But
people
yeah,
will have to get the book to start to fill in that picture more and more richly, which they'll certainly do when they read these poems. Thank you so much, Michael. That was marvelous. Luke, you want to get your screen going here? There he is. And I have to shuffle my pile of books here. Here's Luke Hathaway's new volume. It is called the Affirmations. And what to say about this book? You wanna start with the title, and then you want to start riffing on it. What are all the different things that affirmation can mean? And you're gonna be pointing the book in all the right directions towards questions of affirmation, towards questions of identity, towards questions of the truths that can be affirmed in spiritual and psychological and mythopoeic ways, as the speaking voices of these poems fall in conversation, both with themselves and with all of scenes, all of literature, all of myth, all of spirit more largely. Luke, you're going to tell us a little bit about which poem you're reading and the unique method of antiphonal method you're going to use to read it. Go ahead.
Marvelous. Thanks, Jeffrey. So you were speaking about the mythopoeic textures of that book, and so we're in mythopoeic time all the time, right? And in the particular kind of mythopoeic calendar, which is the Christian church calendar, we're in the midst of Holy Week right now. It's Maundy Thursday, and so this is a kind of penitential moment of preparation for the resurrective season of Eastertide. And in some liturgical traditions, it's conventional to spend this time in the company of, amongst other texts, the Lamentations of Jeremiah, which is an Old Testament book in which the city of God speaks laments in the voice of a woman who has been abandoned. And the composers of the French Baroque set some of these really beautiful and devastating words to music, creating a body of song that's called by the name of the Leçons de Ténèbres, the Lessons of Darkness, which I find to be a tremendously evocative phrase. So the poem that I'm going to perform for you with the help and collaboration of my friend Daniel Cabina is called by that name, Leçons de Ténèbres. And as the Leçons de Ténèbres often are, it's divided into 3 sections, each named for one of these last 3 days of Lent leading up to Eastertide. Leçons de Ténèbres. 1. Le Jeudi Saint. Let us bring our grief to numbers, like a cloth spread on a table, like a table of unfinished board, or like a cloth the blue of chicory, or like a lamed placed, a cup upon a table. Et videte sias dolor, sicut dolor meus. Are there syllables in English capable of this falsetto voice that's singing out its heart in lamentation? I mean Latin. Me minavit et eduxit in tenebris non en lucem, breaking in these Hebrew letters in the darkness where you lead me. Aleph, 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 Beth. There was never grief like hers. In all the mornings into which the sun arose improbably, uncomprehended differently by every day, in all the evenings into which it fell, a flesh stone from the topmast cross tree, and in all the nights, no grief like hers, and none like mine, and none like yours.
Le Vendredi Saint.
There is the dark that falls upon. There is the dark that lies upon. There is the dark that lies in wait. There is the dark that doesn't lie in wait. It simply waits attendant on the water's face before the names exist for day and night. For what is it waiting, this attendant dark in which I find myself awake? Wake up. Explain again to my tenebrae your light.
Le samedi saint.
Over here, no sight, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch. I wake, a smaller darkness opening onto darkness. And yet, whose voice, if I awake, but yours, whose voice you say is calling from the heights to bid me wake so I won't miss your call, bids me awake, whose light, if I arise, but yours, whose light you say is dawning there so I won't miss your dawn, bids me arise.
Thank you so much. Beautifully done, both of you. I'm not sure whom I want to start this conversation with. Dan, it was wonderful. Your voice mesmerizing and beautiful, but I was as equally as captivated by watching your hands, where your hands were sort of conducting your voice in a sense, but not just conducting it. It was like you were marking every intonation as your voice moved up and down, and I felt like you were reproducing in manual form, if you like, what Luke's language was doing as well. Just the intonations from line to line. I'm imagining that's a shared spirit that has that is part of what brings you together.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry, I'm amazed by how similar singing is to speaking, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And well, as you see, I have some friends around me of in
Yes.
instrumental kind, and I never cease to be amazed how similar making music with your hands is to singing and to speaking.
Yeah.
So all that gesture and embodiment, it comes together somehow.
Yeah.
In a moment of singing and speaking.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And then Luke, you've got the opening line of this poem itself. Let us bring our grief to numbers. We could go on for an hour just sorting that one out, right? But part of it is musical numbers, and then the numbers of your lines, numbers as in potential listeners and hearers of the word as you speak it. And you frame these first and third sections with something that's talking about that world of shared grief, and none like mine and none like yours. Your poems are always conversations in the largest sense that way.
Yeah, I'm talking to my friend John Dunn in that first line.
Yeah.
He writes, grief brought to numbers cannot be so fierce, for he tames it that fetters it in verse.
Very nice. Your conversation goes over to the subject of your dissertation, your annotated collection of the earlier poems of Richard Outram, and you have an echo, an allusion to an Outram poem at the end of this series. And yeah, that sense of you start with a Dunn conversation and you move over to an Outram. It's so inclusive. It's so and yet emanates outwards into always new possible identifications.
One of the reasons it was so beautiful to have you in the recording studio, Dan, one of the many reasons, as we were making the kind of audiobook, is that the poems are so full of interlocutors, and so it would have felt very strange to be alone in that studio, and Dan brings the other voice.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you very much to you both. Thanks, Dan. That was very beautiful. Thank you, Luke. Let's scoot along to Alexandra Oliver. Alex, why don't you activate your screen while I show the front cover of your latest book, Hail the Invisible Watchman. You heard me name the other titles of Alex's achievement to date in her writing career. Alexandra Oliver is like, Canada's, if not like North America's Richard Wilbur, James Merrill, just an extraordinary verbal wit and dexterity, the handling of a line, again in these kinds of musical terms. That's of course a conversation that we could invite the poets, all of these poets, to have, since they each have their own investment in music. But it's this kind of ecstatic relationship in Alex's poems between, on the one hand, the everyday, the familiar, the domestic, and all the risks and stakes that attend to those worlds, and the world of verbal play, just magically achieved in this book, as in all of Alex's work. So Alex, what have you got for us this evening?
Oh, well, I have two poems, two very different poems from two different sections of the book. And the first poem is called The Song of the Dwyane. In every town, there's always that person who's the queen bee. And this is a poem about a queen bee. Song of the Dwyane. The Dwyane was top of the heap in this town. Her parents were wealthy as Croesus, and the pearl of the future was all hers to own, while everyone else went to pieces. Her husband got taller, her children more clever. The house on the block kept expanding forever. In a place where the liars laid low, the Dwyane desired to grow. She sidled her way to the sides of the women who seemed to be new and untested. Her smile had the uniform crispness of linen, so none of them ever protested. They came to her house and they sipped on her wine. They felt themselves wilt in the heat and the shine, until, when the spell was undone, the Dwyane devoured the sun. The ones that she chose were awash in their fears, their firmaments roiled with trouble. Their problems with money had aged them by years, and half of their kin were unstable. And when they decided they'd someone to trust, they told the Dwyane, who dissolved in disgust and dropped them and left with no traces, well shot of their middle drawer faces. The Dwyane is top of the heap in this town, a legend, if shorter and squatter. Embarrassments found her, a freight all her own, but that is a personal matter. She threw in her lot with the silvery others, the affluent, arrogant, terrified mothers. To thank her, I'll give my mind's eye. I've made sure the Dwyane won't die. And the second poem comes from a section of the book called The Blood of the Yeagers, which tells the story of an haute bourgeois family who, there are cycles of addiction and abuse that run through this family, and how they affect people, in particular the women of the family. And there are three principal women in the narrative trajectory. There's Anaïs, who is a society wife. There is Ottilie, who is the daughter, who is sort of awkward, bookish and awkward, and sort of pushed to the side in favor of the son. And there is the son, Simon's wife, Anu, who is, she comes from somewhere else, and she has to adjust to this new family with these expectations. And this poem is in the voice of Anu, and sort of shows her disillusionment, and it's called Grass. When the cop came, I was ready. I was sitting on the lawn of some house on 49th, having changed the baby's diaper right in front of the big front window, in between the toys and sprinklers. It's been 7 months already, 7 months of my life gone, day on week on month. Stay at home looks good on paper, but that's what made my mother hollow. That's what turned us into drinkers. Will my baby's love be heady, like how Simon loves his mom, sugary blarney filling his mouth, when I get a different flavor, palm and sweat and soggy pillow, every time he fails or angers? Come and get the little lady, constable. The car has room for all of us, for all our wrath. Me on the lawn of the lucky neighbor, hands in the grass in twilight's shadow, rubbing in shit with all 10 fingers.
Wonderful, Alex, thank you. And going from that last line, let's have a conversation in your poems about, there's always this wonderful relationship between your formal dexterity on the one hand that invokes, to most ears, I guess, a kind of exquisite propriety, right, on the one hand, but also in your work, this kind of intense body, BAWDY, risking impropriety, risking the exotic and the sort of countercultural in all its intuition. You must see those as at one with one another in some curious way.
I definitely do. Like, I was brought up in a very formal environment where, I managed to get away with a lot of stuff within the constraints of a very sort of traditional European family. And I love the idea of collision and subterfuge, things, colliding in the poem space, and also just being able to get away with stuff because, well, it's in form,
Yes.
but there's this, there's this fight going on, and that's what I really enjoy.
What people won't know, possibly until I say this, is that Alex's work, her doctoral dissertation at McMaster, is partly kind of moves in the same domain, right, Alex? That is, you're looking at the realities of domestic and psychological agon, strife. And yet you're exploring how certain, in this case, American poets of the middle century were recreating those stakes in verbal terms. And it sounds like you're really extending that exploration in your own poems in certain ways.
It's nice, yeah, they feed off each other. Like, my doctoral work has really informed Hail the Invisible Watchman and vice versa. It's been from a time perspective, it's been chaotic, but from a sort of a fruition standpoint, it's been really successful, I hope.
Yeah, very much. And then just from the perspective of of women poets and the stakes of identity for women writers, I've been very interested in following your work over these years in how you have imagined the whole question of verbal form, prosody, working with rhyme, as something that has sometimes been associated with an order that is not the woman's order, and such that they've, you're showing writers working inside that order and yet breaking it at the same time. I was always very impressed by how you did that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very inspired by the writings right now of Susan Freeman, and Extreme Domesticity is the book to read. And it's all about how domestic practice has been able to sort of contain a lot of sort of subversive goings on. So improvisation, humor, anarchy. And so you can manifest that in domestic practice as you can in the formal poem space.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Always that reciprocity, that intersection. Well, thanks. Thank you,
Thank you.
Alex. There it is again. Hail the invisible watchman, everyone. We're going to move on to the last segment of our reading. I'm checking over on my own screen whether there are any questions that have popped in yet, but I get to ask one to everybody. So we'll call up all the screens at once if we can. And I had two that I was thinking of that I guess have been part of our conversations through the hour, but I was going to say, poem as craft, poem as history, go and see what each of you had to say, because I think there really is a conversation between your three achievements, this tension between your attention to craft and what in particular for each of you history means. Do you want to do a little daydreaming, any of you or each of you, on that issue? And if not, I have another question. There was because I was just daydreaming with that before. It was suggested that we ask at the beginning of the hour. It was suggested that we ask, what was your first poem, and what that you remember. But what I would prefer to ask, what is your last poem? That is, if you get to choose your last poem, what do you imagine it as being?
Last poem as in not written yet?
The poem that has not been written yet, that in when the collected poems of ... come out, it will be the last one in the book. How do you picture that poem?
Ooh.
I always figure I'm done, like I'll be lucky to ever write another one. I don't assume, so I think back on the last thing I wrote,
That's the last one. Yeah.
couple weeks ago. That's pretty good. A couple weeks ago, poem deigned to present itself
Yeah.
to me, and I'll just have to rest with that.
Yes.
Yeah. It was inspired by a wonderful poem by Thomas Kinsella called Mirror in March, and I wrote a poem that sort of reflects it and reflects upon it.
Very nice. Very nice. Part of what I guess what I like is the silence that you're giving me at the same time, because you don't get to choose, right? And but I do sort of believe that our intuitions would land on something, presumably summary of some kind.
I want to write a science fiction poem.
What's that?
I want to write science fiction, like a science fiction poem.
Yes.
Like something with like evil scientists or aliens and evil scientists and, lizard people and,
yes, as a kind of fun sort of pratfall gesture at the end of the career. That could be brilliant.
I can't die like it's like, oh yeah, that's the woman who wrote about the miserable housewives. It's like forever destroyed.
Michael, whatever yours turns out to be, and don't be in any hurry to write it. It's going to end with some glorious accumulated neologism that the world will spend the rest of its own life exploring and figuring out.
Well, I don't know about that. My style's constantly shifting.
That's true.
It definitely did for this collection.
Yeah.
I don't really contemplate these things. I guess like I'm constantly just trying to live in the moment and, deal with the kids. And what I find interesting is the notion when Luke said the poem coming to him. Um, it's somewhat romantic, but I wish more poems actually worked that way and actually came to me. I find lately it's more of a slog, and it's almost like I have to plan them and really work on them. I'm not sure with the other two. Do you find that you still have a lot of the muse visiting you, and those magical moments where a poem just emerges and it's like you start and then 2 hours later you have this wonderful poem that was bestowed to you by the gods? Or is it more slogging like I find these days?
I think the raw materials can strike at any time. With me, it's usually I'm either in the shower, on the treadmill, or like in the grocery store, and then the idea comes. And of course, you have no pen, right? And you just can't stand in the aisle, like just doing things for 15, 20 minutes. But refinement takes time. But the idea, the actual sort of rattling germ of the poem can attack at any time, for me.
We have a question from our listeners that I can throw out to all of you. Plato, there's a scary first word for a question coming at you. Plato would argue that poets pull us away from reality and allow our emotions to rule unchecked, which was always Plato's fear in the Republic. How would you respond? Being pulled away from reality in such a way that your emotions are unchecked. Got anything to say about that?
I would disagree. I think poetry brings us closer to sort of a heightened reality. And since they mentioned Plato, poetry brings us closer to the forms, to the original word, the original tree, the original flower. Yeah, poetry actually takes us out of the cave, if we're speaking about Plato again.
Yes.
Right? It's a form of enlightenment. And yeah, I think if anything, it's guiding us towards reality, a heightened sense of reality.
Yeah. Very nice. Luke or Alex?
Luke, you want to speak first?
Sorry. Yeah.
Luke, you want to go first?
Well, Plato and I were drinking in a bar one time, and he tried to ask me a question kind of like that. And I thought he was just trying to cover up the fact that he feels stuff.
He said poetry is a tough racket. Yeah.
Bukowski. I have to say, I like what Anne Sexton says, and I stick it in the dissertation, like, I'm rather uptight at the best of times, but one thing I love about form is that form is a trick to get to the truth. And that's what Anne Sexton says, and I really believe in that. Like sometimes you get into the groove of a meter and the meter carries you along, and sometimes you end up saying something completely different from what you intended. You're sort of, Iggy Pop used to say, love is like hypnotizing chickens. Well, sometimes the form hypnotizes you in such a way that you're taken on an entirely different journey and you end up with an entirely different set of conclusions. So it leads you to feeling rather than feeling leading you somewhere else.
Yes. Yeah. In a curious way, that sort of lines up nicely with what Michael started us off with in responding to that question. Our association with the forms of poetry as a kind of truth-revealing spirit initiative, and yet something else that lies at the heart of Plato's allegory that maybe the question asker is getting at is that there is something illusory about the cosmologies of poems. We create illusions, and we could look at the exquisite verbal play in each of your poems as creating a kind of there's clarity there, the play is itself, it's invested in itself as play. It's invested in itself as creating realities that aren't necessarily so at the same time, that are an expression of imaginative metaphoric activity. And that's getting at its own kind of, that has its own truth. So it turns Plato inside out, and it ends up in the same place that Michael was suggesting, that is, that there is a profound truth, even in the cave. It's just that it has to be recognized as such and then invested in as such. Let me pop over and see what else we've got here. Oh, did the pressure to publish get to you? Talking, imagining about certain stages in your career, or maybe still. There was a question that came before that sort of linked to it, and that is just sort of maybe reminiscing or characterizing your own publishing process.
I kind of just fell into it.
I also want to echo that as well. Sorry to interject. Yeah, my route to poetry sort of came through a poetry workshop class at the York Public Library, led by James Deal. And yeah, I was basically, he was my mentor.
Wonderful.
I was this young guy in high school whose teacher couldn't help him anymore. She suggested I attend this workshop. I showed up with these horrid poems. I was ripped to shreds by some of the other poets there who workshopped the poems. And it took every ounce of courage and fortitude to return the following week. And that's when I started to become a poet. But yeah, I was meeting Alan Briesmeister and all these wonderful poets at the time, and starting to hang out with poets. And it just naturally happened that I got published. And it never occurred to me that I wouldn't get published. It was always when I start publishing, right? I just knew it would happen.
Yeah. Good old Jim Deal. You know what? Jim Deal is our kind of, he's our Canadian Walt Whitman, right? He's this great sort of Walt Whitman figure. And when I had that thought, I was reminded that there is that characteristic of Walt Whitman's spirit in this book, Michael, of speaking for the generous and self-erasing self, that then it tries to include all voices. So Whitman's idea of, I speak for this, I speak for the silent, I speak for the runaway slave, I speak for these figures. And there's a kind of audacity in that, but also a humility in it at the same time. And I feel like that's a line that your poems are trying to walk too, in speaking of these men who sacrificed their lives in war.
Yeah, it's a wonderful way to look at it. Of various connections that people have made, that's the first one, Whitman. And now I'm a bit flabbergasted, but I could see the connection there. And yeah, James Deal, I never thought of him being like Walt Whitman as well, but you're very right. And of course, here was the other thing I quickly learned when I was a quote unquote young poet. A lot of them were Americans. James Deal's originally American. Alan Briesmeister, originally American. Rube Borson, all these people I was learning from, they were all Americans, actually. So
yeah.
And I copied Deal. I mean, I remember when it was the very first poetry I had, it was a James Deal poetry, and I had like 5 minutes. And my friend's mom came, and then she said something like, oh, I like your James Deal poems, Mike. They were really good. I copied him to a T.
That's how we develop our own voices. You copy other people, and it will never come out like them. It'll always come out like you, slightly different from yourself in some curious way, and that's how you keep pushing into new possibilities.
Yeah, and I'm thankful to Deal because he's so tight and an incredible editor. my poems have changed drastically. I'm far more fluid now. But yeah, originally, very short poems, very deal-like, I must say.
Yes. You've made me wonder whether any of you, I don't know, Luke, do you have anything to say about this relationship between your magnificent skills, as Michael was just celebrating them as an editor, and your brilliance as a poet? Those are, I guess, they must always be in conversation with one another, but they are different skills.
I think the common ground is it's conversation. I love to talk to people, and when you were talking earlier, Michael, about the source and where the poems come from, I really think for me it's all conversation. And if I feel like I'm in conversation with someone, then I can write poems. If I feel like I'm not, that's sort of like the dark night of the soul, when the voice won't come. And I think I love editing books because it's just like getting to be part of a great conversation, at its best. Really being in the world of textual creation, and there's someone else there wandering around in it. And not only that, they made the world that you're wandering around in when you're the editor, right? And it's such a privilege. And you do feel it's really humbling too, because you think like, oh my, I just stepped on that leaf, like maybe I've sort of like destroyed the whole like ecosystem, the whole galaxy, right?
It's part of the sweet humility of your poetics that you would feel so, but you're also a sort of master trailblazer through that leafage, through that green space. Alex, you're kind of working in similar terms, certainly in your thesis, but that sense of a conversation with other voices, and somehow exploring the possibilities of your own voice in relation to them. Oh, yeah, audio.
Sorry, not very good with the tech. There are two advantages there. The first is you can kind of hide your impulses inside another person. And the second is it kind of affords you this wonderful intimacy. Like, you're never alone with your poems. I know this sounds really ridiculous, but my poems, the people in my poems become my friends, and I care about them. And I can tell things to my poems, and they listen. And I say this in my dissertation: a poem listens to you and responds to you. And this is one of the great gifts of the writing process, is you're not controlling everything. It's like something is given back to you as well. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Again, we've circled around it 2 or 3 times, just this notion of reciprocity, that what is given is received, and how that's working both in the poetic spirit, in intersections of voices, histories, and so on. Nicely done. We're out of time. It's right at the top of the hour. I want to let you know we're all winners tonight, but there are also the winners of the little book packages, and I'm advised that those are the names of the winners for the book packages are posted in the chat. So have a look there, folks, and see if your library is a pound or two heavier than it was at the start of the hour. We finish off, and I want to thank again our 3 wonderful poets, Michael Fraser, Luke Hathaway, and Alexandra Oliver, all published this season with Biblioasis Press. And normally at the end of a reading in a room somewhere, we would have set up the table so that it was blocking the exit, and there would be all the books there on the table. And you wouldn't, you'd go by and you'd buy 1 or 2. You're not in that situation. There's no table blocking a door inviting you to contribute. But there are all the clicks that you can do online to order these books by Biblioasis, and we encourage you to do so. You've had a wonderful taste of the riches that are available in each of these 3 books, and we encourage you to go out and pick one or all of them up. So thanks again to our organizers, to the Alumni Association, to the folks at Biblioasis, and we wish you all a good evening.